the session. Thanks, to make the session again available. As usual, we might wait a few more minutes to let people join more or less timely. I know it's a bit late in Vietnam, but I know that Oscar is already here. So he will be later introducing himself when we start the session. I will give it a moment then. Until then, let's wait a moment and see that everyone has a chance to join. It's also nice that Mitali is actually joining today. She was there all the way in the beginning for the planning, but then hasn't had the chance so far to join. So I'm really excited for that as well.
Yeah, I missed the last 2 sessions, but hopefully I'm gonna be there for the rest.
That's great. Also, for anyone who feels confident with turning on their cameras, we're also always very happy to see the people's faces and not only their names on the screen. So that's very welcome, especially for the session afterwards, when we might talk a bit more in detail about some of the practices we're learning today. But of course, feel free to do as you feel most comfortable. Guillaume has also joined. That's great. So we both, the both speakers from today for the introduction to open source practices are here. Afterwards, we, after the introduction of Guillaume and Oscar, we will have a short moment to think and co-create about the design contest theme. And then, as usual, the last hour of today will be dedicated to an exercise again, in which we put into practice what we're learning. For that, Daphne will join. She has some other commitments in the start, unfortunately, today, but she will join a bit later to co-facilitate the session. I will also share again the Miro board now with the being further within the time of these sessions. It becomes a bit more heavy, so it takes a bit more time to load. I would recommend that you may open it already now if you want to let the content load in the background. If not, you will have another chance later after or during our break just to open it on the background, and then we will be able to start together quite timely after the break on the exercise. So let's wait just 2 more minutes and then we can start.
Chào mọi người, các bạn vừa mới vào Zoom á, thì trong lúc chờ đợi có thể mở cái trang Mirror lên. Tuần trước có ai chưa có kịp điền bài tập thì có thể tranh thủ trong lúc này nhé. Tối hôm nay thì mình sẽ có 2 phần, một phần là chia sẻ từ các diễn giả trong giờ đầu tiên, xong rồi cái phần thời gian còn lại thì mình sẽ có buổi thảo luận nhóm để cùng kiến tạo cái chủ đề cho cuộc thi sau khóa học này.
So while some more people might join, I'm just going to give the introduction of today's session. As usual, please feel free to, at any moment, share any doubts or questions if you don't understand something within the chat, and myself will try to further explain as much as possible. And with that, I would like to introduce Oscar and Guillaume as dear colleagues from Fab Barcelona. who will be talking today about open source practices. So we already talked last week about systemic design and sustainable design practices, which has been quite a dense topic and maybe a bit more complicated and complex to understand. I hope that the exercise afterwards was bringing it a bit down to earth and in a more tangible way. Same we're going to do today. So Oscar and Guillaume are going to talk about open source practices, actually in a very practical way. So that is really nice. And afterwards, again, we will do an exercise in which we can use some examples from last week to test how this could look in practice when we do it ourselves for our products or projects in the future. So that will be really nice, I hope. Yeah, so I will not further be the monotone voice of the session. And if I don't know if you want to add something, otherwise I would give the microphone to Guillaume and Oscar.
Please go ahead, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Oscar, Guillaume, it's your moment to shine.
Hey, thank you all for having us here today. My name is Guillaume Camperdon. I'm currently the Executive Director at Fab Lab Barcelona, and over the last 10 years, I work in a project called Smart Citizen, currently by my colleague Oscar Gonzalez, who is the lead of the sense-making area at the Fab Lab Barcelona, and he'll introduce himself in a bit. And we'll guide you today through the open source practices with a use case. So we don't want just to throw here keywords. We don't want to throw you with ideas that are hard to implement. But we want you to guide you through a real example of how we use open source practices at Fab Lab Barcelona to build projects, to empower communities, and to create resilient ideas that sustain over time and that actually grow farther than our boundaries. So today will be Oscar and me talking, primarily Oscar, but also me giving some insights. And so Oscar Gonzalez, if you want to introduce yourself a bit as sense-making lead at Fab Lab Barcelona before.
Hello, everyone. I hope that you can hear and see me well. As Guillaume says, my name is Oscar. I'm, we could say, a converted engineer. Worked in the field of technical development in a big automotive company for the past 6 years. And then I moved on to Fab Lab, where I develop actively with Guillaume and other people in the sense-making area in the Fab Lab, and more particularly in the Smart Citizen project. And here we will try to introduce you, as Guillaume was saying, to some of our practices and ways in which we put, in particular, open source practices in the context of sensing and environmental data collection. Should we start it?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Please thumb up if you see it, when you see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Adapt a little bit here. Okay, so let me go to the main slide of the presentation at the beginning, which is, we like to call this presentation like a journey of smart cities, or from smart cities to smart citizen, or the story of sense making, which is this area that somehow holds everything inside of Fab Lab Barcelona regarding environmental sensing, citizen participation in terms of environment and data collection. So I think we can summarize to give you a small insight about what we think sense making and smart citizen. And we really think that the way to relate to the environment and to take care for it will only happen if we understand it. So we really think that we need to collect data and understand the environment, how it behaves, to be able to take care for it. That way, we will be able to relate to it more and understand air quality, how the water, the sea in our town, what is the water that we drink, what is the air that we breathe. And we like to think that we provide tools for collecting data, and that not only our sensors and hardware, but also other things like a platform to store the data, or a way to visualize the data, or methodologies to engage people and make these processes more accessible and somehow democratic. So this translates into three main aspects. We, as part of the Smart Citizen project, develop sensors that are mostly related to air quality, but we also do water, fresh and seawater quality, and that we want them to be as easy to use as possible and as customizable as possible. We provide also a data platform for storing the data and visualizing it and telling stories around the data. Also, we provide more tools for more advanced things like analysis around the data that you collect, etc. And finally, but not the least important, let's say finally but not least, citizen participation tools. So we try not to just be a sensor and a platform, but we also provide tools to engage people with the sensors, with the data, and with the process in terms of participation. So I would like to give you a little bit of our history, because that will allow us to introduce you to many key aspects with respect to the open source practices and other, let's say, initiatives that we have been part of. So the project starts back in 2012, roughly, where there was this huge, let's say, fashion about the different shapes of a city. It could be, by then you could talk about many different cities, like the industrial city, the green, the sustainable city, the digital city, and one of them was very prominent, being the smart city. And we asked ourselves, what is a smart city? And looking into it, what you could find was pictures like this one, which are, this is the winner of the best smart city in the world in 2013, which was Rio in Brazil, which was filled up with computers, a lot of cameras, and a lot of people analyzing data, checking on the citizens, and other examples like IBM concept of a smart city, trying to connect everything, but leaving the question of what is the role of the citizen in here. And this was probably a little comic about, but true, is it a passive citizen or is it a consumer citizen that is not involved in the city and the issues around it, and doesn't decide and doesn't have any implication on how the city is transformed? And here comes probably the most important question: what can we do about it, especially from the perspective of a Fab Lab, being hubs for where digital fabrication can be used in very different ways, and we can rethink a little bit how those cities are shaped. And that's where the project was born. The Smart Citizen project was born then as a response to the smart city trend or fashion. And of course, the name has a lot to do with it, trying to not have smart cities and citizens, but also smart cities maybe, but most importantly, smart and committed citizens. And we provided open source technologies in different ways, from hardware to data to platforms and citizen engagement for people to participate in their city and to take decisions. So the project initially started as any project with prototypes in laboratory. In a Fab Lab, you probably know this type of setups. You recognize maybe some electronics in those pictures, Arduinos, jumper cables, acrylic cut with laser cut, and little by little started evolving into something more, let's say, standard and industrialized or able to be commercialized. And it went through different crowdsourced initiatives. One of them was Goteo. Maybe Guillem, here you can talk a little bit about this one, as you were part.
Yeah, sure. I mean, today we are not discussing, let's say, funding or financing or sustainability models yet. I think it's important to understand how early on in the project, we considered that the only way to build it was with the community, with people. We know that we were a Fab Lab Barcelona. We didn't have the financial capacity nor the industrial capacity of a big company to launch such an initiative. So we had to rely on building a community. So we thought that the best way actually to promote that we were building a community, to actually build that technology upon, was to run a crowdsourcing campaign. So we did this crowdfunding campaign first in Barcelona, targeted at the local citizens to actually test ourselves if it was possible to run this smart citizen idea in Barcelona. And that is where we raised the 13,000 euros that you could translate maybe to your own currency. After the Barcelona, let's say, campaign and showing that we reached our goals, we wanted to actually test it not only in Barcelona, but worldwide. So we went for a crowdfunding campaign in Kickstarter in 2013, so quite a long time ago, and we raised 68,000, above the 50,000 goal that we set. And I think it is a way to say that when you want to build a project that you want to be open, you want to engage the community, it's not only about following open source practices as business as usual, but it's actually about engaging the community as much as possible. And that's how we want to talk today here with you.
Perfect. Thank you for those insights, Guillem. Here are some of the images of the initial sensors, and here you can already see some of the key concepts. For instance, all or almost all of the enclosures that we develop are transparent, with the idea that you can see the sensors inside and that they don't hide. There's nothing to hide. It's a device that you can open and that you can see where the sensors are, and you can see the different components on the electronics. This is one of the initial designs at the very beginning, but that reflects a little bit on that idea. Here as well are more images of the initial platform and the enclosure. And let me reflect a little bit on this idea on what we do and why we think that this changes a little bit with respect to other approaches. Here, traditionally, you will think that if you want to collect data, environmental data, a lot of companies already offer that. Can be on an open way even. And they have this concept of a kit, let's say a sensor unit that sends data to a platform. In our case, the idea is that we somehow live in the intersection of these three things, which is the hardware, which is of course open source, the platform that holds the data and has open data accessible to anyone, and finally the community, meaning that the community is active in a way that we will show as well later, and leaving us in a position where the project is actively developed by us, but it also can live without us. And that is quite important as part of the open source practice, because opening the project is not only releasing the source code, but also being able to allow for replicability and involvement of other people in the development. And we think that this is somehow what we are managing to create with this project, and involving other people into improving the sensors, analyzing the data, designing enclosures, so on and so forth. And we will try to show that from now on in the following slides. Here, well, some more images highlighting as well the idea of people participating in the process, and in different cases, it reached to different levels as well. Not only, let's say, for adults, but going into the schools and trying to build literacy and methodology for teaching kids and engaging them into understanding the environment. And obviously, well, little by little, you'll see, you might have heard even of the smart citizen before, but it got quite a bit of, let's say, press impact, and people, let's say, working on it, and sharing in social media as well, some as like other Fab Labs as well, here in the Green Lab or Fab Lab in Nambia, different initiatives, etc. So let's go through some of these concepts that we were talking about. So one of them is the concept of the sensor as a unit that is already transparent and that people can modify and tinker with. All the designs are open and are transparent for a reason, and this is because we want to involve the people directly from the minute zero into the preparation process of the hardware. This is not a closed device like a telephone or a laptop that you just get into a box and you open it and that's it. But we let the people assemble it. So you put the sensor together, you understand the different components through the setup process, and you see how it lives inside an enclosure, and little by little you understand how it goes. Even the enclosures, you can 3D print it yourself. If you have if you don't have a 3D printer or a Fab Lab nearby, that is okay. Of course, not everyone has that. But if you somehow are lucky enough to have a 3D printer, maybe at home or in a Fab Lab, you can download all the files for the enclosure. You can modify it. You can make it your own. Maybe even put your name and print it and create your own version of the enclosure. In terms of data, here, for instance, there's some images of a project that we carried out here in Barcelona. And the idea is to showcase as well that not only the hardware is a device that maybe you can see the files and understand the different components, but also the data is transparent, and that you can download the data, make visualizations with it, and compare it to other places. And in a somehow with, well, actually in these plots, for instance, we were comparing different areas of the city, trying to understand problematics in a community, in a neighborhood here that had a lot of noise due to nightlife. And it is very important, of course, to bring this level as well in terms of openness. Our data is open, and a lot of initiatives now have open APIs and open, let's say, platforms from where you can download the data, compare it, and not only that, but also provide the tools for this comparison. Because it's not easy to deal and to handle data. It's some people might have it very easy if they have maybe some technical education, if they are used to use Excel or spreadsheets. but it's not always easy to engage with it. So we also try to provide tools for this process and to engage actively on the data comparison and understanding of the issues.
I think it's important to emphasize
finally,
here in what Oscar is saying, just adding a bit, sorry, Oscar, emphasizing that when we talk about open source, sometimes in projects, especially linked to design, we think that the only thing to open source, the only thing to share, it's the design itself. Now, in this case, you could think it's this blue box with sensors inside. But actually, when you think on a project, you need to think much more. And nowadays, even if your project is not oriented towards data collection, like this case, in a way or another, you'll be collecting data. And so it's important to understand the open source practices transversally. In this case, also about how the data collected by these devices is also made accessible, not only open, but accessible to citizens, and through training, engaging them into actually making use of them. Because again, it's not only making things available, it's in engaging people to use it and so to replicate it.
Thank you. Here, for instance, another example, not only into, so we went through the hardware, the platform, the data, also the actions that you can take on it. During different projects, we have tried not to only have citizens or people participate in the project in an open and transversal way, but also to include let's say people in the let's say final steps towards the environmental characterization and action, meaning taking action in the process and doing it into let's say in a active way and involved way as well, allows you to be empowered on what you want to change, and this reflects this idea. So this installation was built as part of a project related to the noise earlier, and was also trying to involve in the design process different actors. So bringing together not only in the design, but also as well in the assembly, bringing people to the Fab Lab and building these solutions. Collaboratively working outside of software design tools as well, allow this device finally to be materialized and created. Here and to the right, you can see Guillem carrying the device to be tested. Finally, as part of this event as well, some other part of this event, or some days after, bringing people together to an assembly physically and reflect on this data, reflect on the process, and thinking of ways in which you can change the use, for instance, in this particular case of the platform, and design with more soft tools as well on how the futures might be. We think is another way or a skill of bringing it into these practices for these projects. Finally, just to reflect also on the idea of the documentation and not leaving project undocumented or into the wild, let's say. Very important as well to create understandable documentation for the hardware, for the sensors as well, but also for the other methodologies that are provided. And here, as part of this Making Sense project as well, a summary of the different tools put into practice as well was quite a big achievement, we could say, bringing together, let's say, different fields of expertise into putting this book together that now is available for anyone to use and replicate as an open. In terms of code, or in terms of other platforms in which we allow for, let's say, the participation, here, if you do, probably you know the GitHub website. It hosts a lot of different open source projects. And here you can see different, all the Fab Lab Barcelona Smart Citizen projects that are related to it. And probably, well, here to the left, there are around 57 repositories with different applications, software, the hardware files, etc. For instance, we generated this today with the different changes and that we create in the code, and not only myself and my colleague here, but other people contributing to the project as well. And here you can see the different development branches that we create as well into it. And how as well this community that not only collaborates inside of the project, but also has an active community where they can discuss. So a lot of people test the sensors, use them for their own initiatives. In the forum, we promote and actively maintain caring for the community, somehow being active into keeping them alive and motivated to test things and to develop them. Some users test and design enclosures and put them online for others to replicate them. And some of them go even a little bit crazy and buy 3D printers and develop things at home, implement sensors, design things, and get really, really involved. But this only happens if you allow for, or if you provide a lot of the different elements that we just discussed. Also, you have to somehow be involved. It's not only about giving the files, but also providing good documentation, being engaged in the forum or in different channels for support, and making somehow your design transparent and accessible, so that it's not so complicated that no one can understand. Maybe Guillem,
sure, yeah.
You want to talk in here?
So, of course, a Smart Citizen project, it's been a long journey, and it's been hard to summarize in just a few slides everything that we learned in that project. And so we are happy, of course, to open the conversation after and provide you much more specific insights about this project on itself. But we want you with it to give you some insights that actually had helped us to identify 5 key learnings in how you actually bring open source to distributed design, or in other words, why open source is a key enabler of distributed design, and how we see that open source is a key enabler of the future design, future as the way we think that design should happen for the 21st century. So the first one of these key learnings is that bits are the new atoms. So we need to understand, and I think it's quite obvious nowadays, that a 3D file is not different than a video file, and a camera is not different than a 3D printer, for the good and the bad. This means that a file could travel all over the internet, either if it is a file representing the enclosure of one of those sensors, representing the electronic design of one of those sensors, the software that goes inside one of those sensors, and that in many cases, these files could be fit in a standard way to machines that actually could produce them, such as a 3D printer. But again, also, as with a camera, it's not only about replicability, it's also about expression, right? We could think that a digital camera, it's only a tool to actually capture information, but it's also a tool to express our ideas. So this idea of sharing, this idea of replicability, it's not against the idea of creativity and the idea of self-expression. The second idea is, Oscar, if you could just click for the second one, just click next. It's that people, they don't understand these ideas of open source by default, right? And when you saw that image, for example, of the kids looking into data, for them to actually understand the importance of owning your own data, of being able to, in this case, for example, to look at this data was air pollution data from Barcelona they collected, and engage with it. It takes time. So whatever your project embraces with the community to deal with open practices, replicating some part of the design, contributing to the design, collecting data that could inform the design, this requires time. And so you need to make it part of your project. So if you actually design a chair and you put it in Google Drive and you share the link in Twitter or Facebook, it doesn't guarantee you that actually a lot of people will do anything with it. So it's important, the idea that you actually need to create literacy, to train people, and that training should be part of your project. So for example, in the Smart Citizen project, we spent many years doing workshops, doing books, to actually explain what this idea of open source means, from collecting open data to making open source electronics, to making, for example, the enclosures for the sensors in a distributed way. What means that I might produce the electronics centrally in one place because it's cheaper due to, let's say, economies of a scale, but actually I will print the much more bigger part of the designs, which are the enclosures, locally through the Fab Lab network. And to make people aware of that, you need training. You need actually to spend time and consider it a first priority. The second one, it's open source. It's about replicability. And I think it's what I said about a chair and sharing it online. So the documentation is more important than the license. So if you go, for example, to platforms such as GitHub, where you could find open source software or even hardware nowadays, you could find actually that there's a lot of software pieces that include licenses which are open source, right? From, let's say, GPL licenses, MIT licenses, Creative Commons licenses. Maybe some of those sound familiar to you. But for us, this is not the most important part. The most important part is how you create that documentation. So actually, when people access that content, they are able to replicate it, they are able to use it. Again, and continuing with this idea, replicability, it's about engagement, right? It's about empowering your community early on. And so if you are actually going to promote open source practices in your project, but you don't plan to spend time working with your community, maybe even building a community, right? Because the first thing is to understand, okay, who's my community, or communities in plural. So you need to actually to take this into account. And so I think we should talk more about replicability, the idea that your project or a part of your project could be replicated, could be manufactured in a different place, could be used in places that you didn't plan it will be used. It could be adapted to be used in these new places. That it's the most important thing. And as we like to say here in the Fab Lab, what's the most important key learning is that next time, ask yourself the last question first. What do we mean by this? We mean that many times, especially in design schools, we are taught that first you design something, then you think how to sell it, and finally you think what license you will put on it. So you say, look, I'll design that, and now it's designed, and what I will do is that I am going to sell it in a shop, so I'll put a fully restrictive license. Oh, no, I will make it so it could be used in schools, and schools ask me that they want to make it on their own. Okay, I'll put a license that allows to be 3D printed only for educational use. Okay, that's fine. But actually, if you take decisions at the end, the result is quite poor. It's much better if you think in advance, okay, if I want to make something for schools, maybe it's clever that they could 3D print it on the school. So I need to design something that could be printed at school. So I will use a license that allows schools to replicate it, okay? And from that on, you end up designing something, not the opposite. And that, I mean, I think it's quite obvious, but sometimes as designers, we forget about this. So these are the 5 key learnings that we took during this journey through a Smart Citizen, and we try to summarize here. And I hope you find them useful. Of course, we could talk for hours about open source practices in design. And before we finish and we kind of open the conversation, some of these ideas were compiled in this distributed design book that you could find online and download. And there's a 2-page article that talks about more about what distributed design practices we are following in Smart Citizen that could inspire your next design. So that's all from our side, and just happy to listen to your questions and comments.
Có bạn Nhiều có câu hỏi cho diễn giả không?
I remember in our first conversation, I think in the first one we had, I don't know if the person is present today, we actually had the question about why should I make my design open source? Because sometimes it's way more time consuming to consider also in the process other people and all of these things, and it might not get you to where you want to go. Back then I've shared a bit my perspective on this, but maybe you can say in your own words also again, Guillaume and Oscar, what your reasons or personal reasons would be to go open source and why it's actually interesting at times, but also maybe be not so good at including people within the process of designing a new product or service or project, while the information is still cooking in the heads.
Right. So yeah, it's not an easy question to answer, but it's a good one. I think we shouldn't take open source for granted, as taking it for granted would be not understanding the power that open source practices could follow. It's also important before we talk about open source to understand that open source is an idea, but then it can get implemented in many different ways, and that ways admit a lot of gradients. The most important thing for me is to understand why you are doing something. So, when we decided to do Smart Citizen, we could do it for 3 things. The first one was because we thought that the world actually needed something much better than what companies were offering using their smart city strategies. And so we were not that much concerned actually if this will pay back to us. We were not that much concerned if we'll continue to do that for many years. What actually we know is that we wanted to present the world with a new idea. That's case number 1. Case number 2 is actually when you like a lot to do something, you like it so much that you want to spend all your life doing that thing. You like to design, you like maybe to design sensors, and you want to spend all your life designing sensors. And the third one is when you say, look, I don't like that much about maybe designing sensors, yet I think actually there's a need for them, and I will design, and with the money I will actually make designing the sensors, I could continue to research other things as relevant as my sensors. And these 3 things are important, I think, when you consider licensing. And the one we forget is that many times the importance of your idea, it's not to actually make you reach for the next project. It's not actually to do it for all your life. It's actually to create impact. And this impact, it's not something you want to do alone, nor you are capable to do alone. And in many of these cases, the only way to create impact, sustain over time, that guarantees that your idea is embraced by others, and so that your original impact is spread all over, it's by using open source practices, because it guarantees you that without having the initial financing requirements that you'll need maybe with other ways of approaching production, without actually being to be there for the project to run, the idea that the project is resilient. So after you, let's say, quit the project will continue to go. So we see that the best answer to these questions is open source. And that's why actually the Smart Citizen, after more than 10 years of a project, it's a project that's alive. And it's not only alive by us, yes, we make some money with it, that allows us to continue being here talking to you, but more than this, if to tomorrow, Oscar and myself and other people here at Fab Lab Barcelona will stop working on that project. We know that the project will continue, and that the idea that actually motivated us to build that, which is actually the idea that smart cities could be built in a different way, that we should talk about smart citizens and not smart cities, continues over time.
Thank you, Guillaume. Cynthia, I'm going to ask you because you have your camera on, but if you don't want to go ahead, please let me know. Because you were telling us in the beginning that you're working with textiles. I have no further knowledge about what you do exactly, but do you think this kind of resonates with you, the work we have been talking about?
I'm not sure how it would work. Because I work with artisans, it's all, the textiles are all handloom, hand done, and that's kind of its intrinsic value. So mechanizing, manufacturing, or whatever in that sense kind of detracts from the value of the item because it is handcrafted. But I kind of think that there must be some way that this idea can still come into it with, I don't know, maybe the products and how that works. It hasn't kind of been revealed to me yet. But yeah, I don't know. But I'm intrigued and interested. I do have a question, because I don't really understand how this, how does licensing, it might have been covered last week, and I'm sorry I wasn't here, but how does licensing work with open source? I don't get that. How do you actually, if it's open source, then how can you make money? And even though if the idea is not necessarily to kind of, you know, make huge amounts of money, but whatever, you have to survive. And so how does that work? I don't get it.
I think, you know, your case is a really good example, because I think that you didn't realize the potential of open source because you are fully embraced on it. Why? Because if you work in fabrics, you might be knitting, right? And if you are knitting, you know, there's a different kind of knit types, no? And there's, let's say, the interlock, and there's ribs, and there's things. And these things you can do it without actually having to pay anyone, because they are open source, right? No one patented this bit. And so that doesn't mean, of course, that then you could make a shirt out of it, and your shirt could have actually a design which is registered by you, or maybe not the full shirt, but the printing you put on the shirt. So, but nowadays, with much more modern technology, we don't encounter with it. There's technologies which are closed source from the beginning unto the end. So it means like every time you wanted to kind of start doing some soft knitting, you have first to kind of buy some sort of a license, and more than buying a license, you'll have to be tied to the decisions of a specific company that's deciding the way that your knitting needs to be, you know? And so, and at the end, I think what's relevant is that I don't know exactly your practice with craft and fabrics, but knowing a bit about this wall, I could see that usually there's a mixture about open source practices. Maybe some of them, because they are so old that we don't even consider them open source, but they are open source in a way, right? They are public domain practices connected with much more closed source approaches, like registering, for example, a trademark, which is necessary actually to generate sales and revenue in the world that we live in. No, so what I'm trying to say here is that many of you maybe actually you're already using open source practices, but you don't know. And it's not that much about fully changing actually your end design. It's not about making this cap open source as the design is open and anyone could copy it. It's maybe about documenting the machine that you are using to make this cap so others could benefit from that. And by benefiting from that, it means not that you are giving knowledge for free. It means, for example, that once you create an industry, once there's other people people around you which are sharing the same practices, that usually is beneficiary for you, because suddenly you have actually a community that you could rely to support, to get people trained around one practice, to get people that could support your practice, etc.
I guess the other thing for me is that also the people that I work with, it's not so much public domain, but community owned. And one of the things is more about protecting that community owned knowledge rather than actually getting it out there, because of course there's lots of cases where it is either like culturally appropriated or simply copied, stolen, basically, because the concept of community owned does not sit well in the Western world because they consider that to be open source and fair game, which is a completely different thing to what you're talking about as open source and being shared.
But I love your approach that actually questioning the existing models of intellectual property from the Western world, even open source. I think that's extremely relevant. As I always said, we shouldn't take for granted, let's say, copyright as something that's been always there, right? It's an invention that has less than 150 years. And the same, we shouldn't take for granted open source practices. And I think what's important at the end and what we want to promote with these talks, it's the idea of confronting ourselves in the way that we manage knowledge inside our community. That is perfectly compatible with the idea, for example, of keeping knowledge within a community, or the idea about how you use knowledge to drive a community, which is many times what happened, right? You join a community because you want to acquire certain kind of knowledge, and that guarantees that that community actually it's sustained over time, it's supported over time. There's an engagement on that community over time.
Okay.
Thank you. Does anyone else want make a Vietnam or another representative who would like to ask some questions?
May I have a question, please?
Go ahead.
So like I am a member of like Maker Viet. Sorry, can you hear me clearly? Yeah. So we are hello everyone. I'm from Maker Viet, and we have been building some open source hardware project. But the biggest problem we run into is not the engineering part itself, but as you mentioned earlier, the most important part, and I think personally think the most difficult part is building the documentation. So I have a question here, like how can we build a proper documentation? Because for us, like each individual do it in his or her own way, so we cannot we don't have a proper or standardized documentation, but a very fragmental one, and it's not really helpful for user or anyone else to use this properly. So my question is, do you have any recommendation or maybe some reading material for us to have us structure our documentation and to do it properly?
I start, but maybe then Oscar can continue. He's actually quite an expert on documentation. Several things that help us and that we learn. The first is that we don't write the documentation at the end. It's extremely relevant that we write the documentation as we go. So we started to use documentation for internal communication. So we started to basically document things using documentation tools and following documentation standards as a way to communicate ideas within the team. So it means that once we actually want to share it, of course, we have to edit that information. It's not ready to be published, but it's much closer. Then the second thing also that we learn is that it's important that the documentation, it's not only edited and created by us, but also by other people that actually has less technical knowledge on the topic than us, in a way that actually documentation is accessible. And that means that it's extremely important for us to engage other members of the team, people that's having residencies with us on that. And the last bit and the most most important one that we are starting to promote a lot is that when the community uses our tools in rewards, they actually have to document how they use that technology. So for example, now as part of a grant, we are giving sensors for free to different research institutions to use it. And we are asking the users in these institutions of those sensor boxes to actually document back how they use it, following in a standard procedure, a template that we prepare. So in a way, the community is building the documentation themselves based on their experience, based on their mistakes, etc., etc.
Right. So yeah. So I get your point. So appreciate your question, your answer. Thank you.
I like that Drew asked this question, and William, you answered very nicely in that maybe it's not a specific tool that we're looking at. It's more on how, like, the philosophy of documentation is how we approach it. Not so much about the tool itself, but how we make sense of it, how we use it.
Exactly. For us, that's what's most relevant. Sometimes, for me, people think as open source only about these kind of licenses and these things which are hard to get, and they forget that maybe actually open source in a way too. It's when you go to YouTube and you could learn how to do something just because someone did a video, about how to do it. It's at least in the way to be open source. Of course, there's ways to make it even better open source, but maybe hosting it to other platforms more than YouTube, by actually making maybe a process where people could provide feedback and that it is embedded, but at least a video on YouTube explaining how to do something, that also is an open source practice for design.
May I also take this opportunity to ask, so far, which platforms have you used, and did you encounter any issues with that?
Mostly we are using GitHub, but for the end user or someone who want to contribute but they are not really in the tech field, it's quite hard for them to use GitHub because they have to learn the Markdown language and other stuff. So currently, only a few of us who make the documentation, or sometimes we port some of the documentation from other work into the Markdown language, so we can post it on GitHub. So most of the time we use GitHub and the Markdown language system.
Well, that's a good start already. I think if you know how to use GitHub and Markdown. So for the benefit of those not familiar with GitHub, it's a website. It's a platform where you can upload your source code, your 3D design file, things like that. Electrical diagram, something, so that it's shared and other people can look at it and copy it and modify it.
Thank you. Joe, you also had a question.
Yeah, kind of building on the first question from Tu here. Documentation is important. It has to be done continuously. I understand the approach very well. Nevertheless, would you have any kind of templates or tools that you use, that you apply, that you would recommend, that you find easy to work with?
Thanks for the question. I think, Oscar, maybe you are the most indicated person to answer this. The platforms you use, templates, things that you built over time, things that you discovered recently.
Well, as everything that we have been doing has been a very iterative and evolutionary process for us. We use as well mostly Markdown because it's very simple, let's say semantically or the way that you write is simple. In our particular case, we try to build our documentation with MK Docs. It's a tool for making websites intended for technical documentation. I can probably put that on the chat. But also in the past, we have used different tools online. For instance, another one called hackmd.io, which is an online editor for Markdown, which allows you to very easily see the results real time. And as well as Guillermo is sharing in the chat, that there are different templates and ways to see MKDocs, let's say, engine or result. But this is, you can bring it as far as you want. At the end, you have to somehow understand that there's a basic that this tool gives you, and then you can customize it and evolve it as far as you want. One of the other things that I think it's interesting as well is to use tools that have been there for a long time. For instance, forums. We kind of leave them a little bit behind because probably instant messaging now is more, let's say, powerful because we can access it from everywhere, anywhere, and anytime. But sometimes even in our forum, we post results or analysis there that also serve as documentation. And that is a very easy way for the community to give you documentation of their processes. Maybe they can start learning even some tools like Markdown and get into this mood of giving feedback and being engaged with you. And they don't have to go into maybe these other platforms like GitHub that probably are a little bit more scary at the beginning because they are maybe seen as technical because of the interface or something, but maybe already a forum is something that a lot of people can relate to very easily. So in our case, that and little by little, maybe our workflow goes more in from HackMD, making internal notes, porting that into different formats like presentations or documentation in MKDocs, and then publishing it with GitHub pages normally as an result. And the community interacts with us either through GitHub itself, either through issues or in the forum with their user accounts as a normal forum.
Great, thank you very much. Tu, did you get a couple of ideas here?
Yes, a lot actually. All right, thank you for sharing with us. I myself very appreciate this documentation, this template and tool. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
We also have a question from Hoon, who unfortunately just caught COVID today, so she has sore throat and cannot ask. And she asked me to relay the question. How does open source documentation work for different age groups? So if you have high school students, professionals, university students, do you have like different maybe standards or approaches to open source documentation for these age groups? Like maybe it's a bit more advanced or detailed for working professionals, but can be simplified for the younger groups. So that's the question.
Yeah, so you really have to adapt to your audience. That's for sure necessary. We in our particular case, I think we do a lot of things somehow well as we document, but we also don't have the capacity and we don't adapt it to every different group. So we try to build it or we try to build it in the easiest and more affordable, accessible way possible. but sometimes that might not be generic for different age groups, and we have to create if we want to, for instance, work on a specific case, we create a specific documentation. For instance, right now we're working on projects in which we try to bring sensors to schools, and we try to teach a little bit about how to measure the ocean in schools, and we are creating a specific documentation for that. We're translating some of our documentation into Spanish because a lot of our documentation is written in English, and we're translating it into Spanish and making it a little bit more easy to read, not only in terms of complexity, but also in terms of engagement, so that the students are not bored and let's say you can engage people to keep reading, which is probably just a matter of dedicating resources into different into more specifics, which in small projects tend to be not easy. And in particular, in our case, we try to always concentrate everything in the same website and have everything accessible there. But sometimes we have to as well provide dedicated documentation. One of the things, and I think this is also important, is that we always try to at least keep track of something in text and image format that can be published, for instance, in a document. Meaning that we try not to, for instance, leave things in platforms that then cannot be accessible publicly. For instance, we don't document using maybe chat platforms, or we don't try to collect the images and processes that end up into discussions and bring them into documentation. If something happens in a Miro board, for instance, we try to take that and bring it to documentation as well, and not leave it in the Miro tool, so that then later on is as well accessible. So even if you maybe diverge and take a tangent for a little while, you bring it back again to your main source of documentation as well, so that it's not lost, and you can still reuse it, and some other people can reuse it as well.
In this direction, we always like to say that you should focus on protocols, not platforms, which means that at the end you might end up using a platform, but the most important thing is a protocol. So even if it might sound simple, in all the tools we share you here on the chat, they used a standard called Markdown as a way to write the documentation, which means it's just a way to identify when a title is header 1, header 2, a link, a bold sentence. But using that means that we could then easily port content on a Git book into this course, and from this course to HackMD, and from HackMD to MKDocs. And if one day Git book closes, we could easily export all the information and bring it to MKDocs, and we are not locked into a platform, what the industry usually knows as vendor lock.
Thank you, Oscar and Nguyen. I think what we've shared, like all these platforms, tend to be more relevant to a technical audience. How about how do we translate these practices into other fields like that of, say, Cynthia, or I don't know, maybe an architect or interior designer? I'm not sure.
In the case of, sorry, go ahead, please.
Or artisans also, for example. So I'm just thinking what other maybe more beginners friendly tools that people can are available for people to start using.
I think nowadays a beginner-friendly tool for sure it's making videos. Videos are easy to make. You could record your voice on top, and it's a good way to share knowledge. And not only to share knowledge, is a good way to also connect any audience with your community and with your project. For sure, you saw how many companies nowadays use this strategy to promote their products. There's no company nowadays that they don't make great YouTube videos about the projects they make. And by YouTube videos, I don't mean advertisement. I mean videos where they actually try to engage with their communities. So I'll say video is an easy way to get engaged into that process, especially because all of us nowadays, we have phones, and especially because the most effective video are not those super long ones with really good editing, are short videos that go straight into the point. So that's something that more or less anyone can do. Then if we don't talk about, let's say, the level of maybe, let's say, computer or ICT knowledge, but we think more on topics, it's important not to think that these tools that we just described are only meant to talk about, let's say, software or extremely, let's say, engineering oriented projects. One of the examples I paste for the MK Docs, it's from the class.textileacademy.org, which is the Fabric Academy program that got founded here at Fab Lab Barcelona by Anastasia Pistofidou. And that's a program on textiles and innovation. And it's a project that talks a lot about fabric and about actually how to work with fabrics and innovate with fabrics. And so it has nothing to do with software, yet it uses MK Docs, yet it uses a way of documenting that maybe in the past was considered more close to software. Yet, however, it requires certain knowledge. So I'm not suggesting this as an entry point, rather than saying that this is relevant towards thinking that these tools are not only limited to the engineering practices.
Thank you, Guillaume. To be a bit respectful of the time, I would suggest, if there are no more questions, to take a 5 minutes break, if that will work. If there are no questions, otherwise I'm happy to postpone a bit. In any case, you're more than welcome to share your questions in the chat, also during the break or after the break, and I will make sure to facilitate them to Guillaume and Oscar. I would suggest taking now a 5 minute break to grab some water and refresh their mind. And then I assume that Oscar might be able to still stay around for a bit longer. I have to ask him. Yes, he's shaking his head, so this is good. To support us to facilitate the conversation about potentially finding a theme or an area of interest, a common area of interest for the design contest that is happening together with Fab City after the academy has finished. And then the last 20 minutes, half an hour, we will go to the exercise. We had today a bit more time to talk, which is really nice. But let's not forget that we also want to do something practical to implement our ideas and something like that as well. So yeah, I would say let's meet 20 past 6 minutes and we catch up then. Thank you so much, Guillaume and Oscar, for joining. We'll see you soon, and Oscar, we see you after the break. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guillaume and Oscar. Mọi người ơi, bây giờ mình có thể break 6 phút, 9 giờ 20 mình vào đây lại nha.
Hello, hello. Let's wait a moment or two more until Mai is back. Hello, Mai. Just wanted to make sure. As you may know, after the Design Academy, which is going to be 2 more weeks, you will have a phase for the design contest in which you, the people who are attending the academy, will collaborate with other local actors and creative people in different teams and different ways, potentially as well, on projects that you will identify as your areas of interest in the framework of a specific theme. that addresses maybe some of your local challenges or some local ideas, how Hanoi can become a creative city from the bottom up. And for that, I don't know if Mitali would like to share some thoughts before we go ahead to talk a bit more about the design contest, if you would like, if she's around.
Sure, I'm here. Mai, please help me like translate if required. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so so what's gonna happen is the theme that we co-create today, we will launch an open design contest for all the creatives in and around Hanoi, potentially around Vietnam as well, for projects that for Hanoi-based projects essentially, related to the themes. These projects might be your area of interests in teams or individually, and the contest is gonna take place in 2 stages. The stage 1 is basically a presentation of your concept, very simple requirements, just explanations, sketches, visuals that support it. And then you will get a chance to prototype your conceptual ideas in case they're shortlisted. We're planning to shortlist about 30 projects. You'll get a chance to prototype them at Fab Labs, Maker Spaces, our local partners' facilities, basically, and over a period of time, and then resubmit your projects to like win a chance to not only further develop them or with coaching over 3 months at the end of the year, but also showcase them at local design weeks and also international events like the Bali Fab Fest. And it's basically an excellent opportunity. It's open to all. We accept all all ideas, and it'll be so it's also this session today is a fantastic opportunity because you get to participate not only as a participant, but also kind of in the designing part of the contest, where you are essentially deciding the theme that everyone will participate in. Mai, do you want to add something?
I translated the core part of it. Mọi người có hiểu cái nội dung mà Mitali vừa mới trình bày không? Có tóm tắt đó, là chúng mình sẽ host một cái cuộc thi tìm kiếm những ý tưởng sáng tạo cho Hà Nội. Và cái chủ đề của cuộc thi đó thì sẽ do mọi người tham dự khóa học này cùng quyết định. Cuộc thi thì sẽ có 2 phần. Phần đầu là đi từ cái đoạn gọi là prototype, ý tưởng sơ khởi, trong 2 tháng 8, trong 2 tháng tháng 8 và tháng 9. Thì từ 20 cái ý tưởng sơ khởi thì ban đầu thì được chọn, ban đầu thì mình sẽ chọn ra 3 ý tưởng xuất sắc nhất, và 3 cái ý tưởng xuất sắc nhất thì có thể là thì sẽ được đi trình bày ở Bali, tại cái Bali Fab Fest. Xong rồi sau khi trở về Việt Nam á, thì mọi người sẽ có một cái nguồn kinh phí hỗ trợ để mà có thể là phát triển cái ý tưởng đó hoàn thiện hơn nữa đến tháng 12 thì chung quy là nói như vậy. Và trong cái thời gian đó thì những cái ý tưởng mà được những cái đội mà dự thi thì sẽ làm việc sâu sát với lại các cái Fab Lab hoặc là các Creative Hub để được hỗ trợ phát triển ý tưởng của mình.
Also, Jess, I would like to add that we also have here today Min from Fab Lab Paris, who is a key part of the Fab City Collective as well, and basically strategizing the design contest in Hanoi as a part of Hanoi Creative City. And he's also had experience with organizing big Fab events previously. So he's going to be part of this session as well for the co-creation.
Yes, thanks, Mitei. I'm happy to be part of this this session, this co-creation for the thematic of the contest. I think it would be exciting to see how actually Vietnamese can actually be part of this process and being part of the Fab City vision, and how actually you can apply what you are learning now with the Fab Lab Barcelona and with all the network that and see the result of this contest has, and which will have a high visibility in the different some different events like Vietnam Design Week or Hanoi Design Week, and also the Bali Fab Fest. So I hope it will be great. So now I guess we can start the co-creation session.
So Oscar's here to support me on this, and Daphne is joined as well, which is great. Basically, what would be great to start with is actually to find a common theme or an interest for Hanoi and for your region, is to understand a bit more what you think is meaningful within your city context, and what is you think is meaningful based on your practices. Maybe we can start with that, to share like your practices, your work, your areas of interest, and how that can relate in the city context. We can go on that afterwards. Also, Oscar, if you would like to add on that, please feel free. An easy way to do this is, in case you don't want to speak up and speak in front of the group, you can share what you believe is meaningful for your context and what your area of interest is in the chat of the Zoom, because that might be a bit more easier for you. But feel free also just to share your ideas directly here, to turn your camera on, turn on the microphone, because it's always great to hear from you all.
Mọi người ơi, bây giờ mình sẽ cùng kiến tạo cái chủ đề nha. Thì một cái điểm tốt để mà bắt đầu là mọi người có thể liệt kê ra những cái mối quan tâm hay là sở thích của mọi người. Nếu mà mọi người có thể bật camera lên chia sẻ thì tốt. Nếu không thì cũng có thể viết vào trong cái chat box. Chị có thể mời Ngọc Linh không? Linh ơi, em có ở đó không? Chắc là quay lại sau. Có bạn nào xung phong?
Alo. Hết chưa?
Linh ơi, em vừa nói gì đúng không? Oh well, maybe we can start with Cynthia since she's
Picking on
already
mine.
active.
I have no idea how any of it could fits in with what everybody else is doing, who seem to be, their areas are digital and coding and 3D printing and all of that sort of stuff, which is kind of in some ways a long way from what I'm doing. But I think, I don't know, it would be really exciting. I mean, the things that I'm involved in is kind of, you know, artisan crafts, handcrafted, slow fashion, reduce, repair, recycle, reducing waste, trying to find ways to encourage people to think about what they actually buy and buy well and not buy a lot. I don't know. I mean, an idea that just struck my head, or it came into my head, that I don't know if it's even how it would work, but the idea of having some kind of, I don't know, way to collect data on people to where they actually had to put in what they wore every day, what things in their wardrobe they used and what was the excess in their wardrobe, and as a way of, I guess, educating people that in fact their wardrobe of, you know, 300 or 400 or 500 items in fact mostly is not used, and the same 10 pieces of clothing are worn every day, every week. I don't know, just because that kind of, the whole data collection stuff that the guys have been talking about today kind of made it, that was sort of interesting. But also from, I guess, my other hat, I guess some of the stuff around communication, if there are projects that some of the others are working on or want to work on that need some kind of communicative interface, then that's something that I've got lots of skills in and could help with, although that would be in English and not Vietnamese. So that's another thing. And I think I've run out of ideas now for the minute.
No worries. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for sharing. I think also last week someone has shared that they're working with IoT devices. So maybe that person is present as well today. I don't see it in the room right now.
Okay.
He was here earlier on, Tới, I think.
Yeah, I think he was. I saw him before.
Yeah.
I'll just assume. Oh, oops. I'll just assume that. Sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think Tu also wants to share about his interest.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about games that could tell a story, but like interactive game with some like hardware, like some cartoon gun or something like that. So and the player will follow the plot of the game, and it also tells a story about the culture and the history of Hanoi, something like that. So storytelling games, yeah, with like with like some hardware devices. So like I haven't had a clear idea in mind of what would it be, but like some gun or some device like a radio or something like that. So yeah, so as the user play the game, the story unveil and tell us about our story. I think, yeah.
I love that idea. It's a great idea.
Thank you.
a long time ago, I had an idea. A friend and I had an idea about doing something like that, but that was more, which actually was related to tourism, but having an interactive game activity, something they have on their iPad or whatever, that young kids could engage and interact with as they travelled around Vietnam. But it could also just be, well, could be based on Hanoi, that gave them things that were of more greater interest to them as children than some of that they could have an interface that kind of engaged them, where the parents or older kids could engage with maybe the item in itself, but it was just looking at things from a different perspective, which maybe could kind of go into the storytelling idea too, perhaps.
Yeah, that's very great. I also think like it would be something similar, a little bit similar to the Pokemon Go, like you said, we go to the like a location and there's a story pop up or something like that.
Yeah,
that could be very cool.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. I'm in. Great. Cool.
Do you still see people hunting for Pokemon in Hanoi? For a while, it was very crazy in Saigon. Not so much now, though.
Yeah. So actually, I think he still like love playing Pokemon Go, but not sure he's available for Open the Mind.
Yeah, I've got a question about that. How actually, if it's an application, how actually I'm a bit confused about how the contester, the artist or the participant will actually work on it, because it's I think the idea of the contest was also going to, but maybe I'm wrong, huh? Maybe that I was thinking like how actually we interpret the artisanal craft, the vernacular traditional culture of Vietnam, mixing with the Fab Labs approach, and to be open to designer, architect, artists, and such things. So, and how actually then people can actually submit something for something more, but maybe it could be combined. But that's I'm just thinking about like very practical things, like if you open a contest for a Pokemon Go environment, something like that, then how people will be going inside, or it will be something more virtual, more than actually physical, which could be also one way. But that's something we need to, it's a strong actually access, or a strong I mean, which could be also well, it could be interesting, but it could be also very getting narrow. How to say that? It would be more very specific, I think. But I like the idea of. I think there's something to do something about that. But we have to think about, maybe it would be an output or something like that, more than a team. If I want to say, it's like maybe it could be at the end the exhibition, right? It could be the form of the exhibition more than something like has a like I said, the thematic, because otherwise it's really specific, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for sharing. I mean, I think it's really good to share everyone's opinions and voices, especially in a brainstorming moment. I think it's really good because we're trying to find a theme, to be nice and open, to listen to all the different opinions and ideas already that are already like fluctuating within us. And then afterwards, it's easier to narrow down, to become more specific and make sure that we address the contest in the most feasible way, obviously. So thank you both for sharing. I think there are some really nice narratives to take in a seemingly maybe I don't know how to put this perfectly, but in this connection between old heritage and making techniques and like the cultural heritage of Hanoi, and how we can translate or find ways of translating that in different manners. And that might be in digital forms, that might be in new narratives, and in a playful way, in a gamification kind of way. I think there are a lot of possibilities and how this could be looking. So let's try to stay a bit open-minded with that as well. Are there more opinions or more thoughts and more ideas and what they would like to work on, and or things that they might be interested in?
Các bạn mà chưa có chia sẻ ý kiến về cái chủ đề ưa thích của bạn á, thì có thể viết vào trong cái chat box cũng được nha. Là nghĩ ra được cái gì thì cứ đề xuất cái đấy, không có cần phải cảm thấy là bị giới hạn gì hết. Hường hay là Hữu An hay Tới cũng có thể đóng góp ý kiến nha. Cái gì làm mà mọi người quan tâm hàng ngày?
So maybe this might also take a bit more time. So I completely understand that maybe it's difficult to come up on the spot with an idea of a theme for the contest. I think we already have some good starting points here, which are woven in the fabric of Hanoi and your knowledge and your areas of interest. So I will leave this open maybe, and I would suggest to revisit this if that would be an idea, if that's feasible for also for the team to revisit maybe this topic in the next session as well, to finalize it then.
Yep,
what do you
I
think?
think that's a good idea.
So maybe everyone can think during this week about their personal area of interest, what might be interesting for Hanoi City, creative city, in their hubs, what kind of topics would be interesting to think to work on. You may use this Miro board as a starting point, but you're also more than welcome to add new ideas to it. Every thought is welcome. And we already see some nice narratives there, as I mentioned, for like cultural heritage of Hanoi in connection to new technologies and new interfaces for that.
So another participant, Hương, she cannot speak. She wrote her favorite topic is cooking. So how to help people like her who doesn't know how to cook, but there's still food on the table.
That's an amazing topic to share. And I think it's a really interesting one. Actually, in Fab Lab Barcelona, we are working way closer now with a EU project, which is called Food Shift, on the topic of food and food production in cities. So I think it's a very valid topic to look into. I will share it up here. And it has also a lot to do with obviously like cultural heritage. Like we all know how connected we are to our culture, to our homes through the food that we eat. So really nice. Thank you so much for sharing that. There's
also, I mean, I don't know, cooking, anything to do with cooking kind of gets me interested too. And the whole cultural heritage aspects of that in a place like Hanoi is incredibly rich. But there's also a new organisation, I think that's reasonably new, that's just started up called Viet Harvest, which is about food waste, and it's been supported by an Australian organisation called Oz Harvest, and it's about looking at food waste, redistribution of food. I don't know whether there's something that I don't know. I mean, they're outside of this kind of group, but working in some way that uses, I don't know, data, information, I don't know. Just thinking aloud, I guess.
Thank you very much. That's a really good point as well. I added them as well here.
Thanks.
Or starting to add them, so feel free to expand on that, obviously. Oscar, I see you still here. I don't know if you have some thoughts. I know that you are also quite good at these topics, so maybe you have some thoughts when you're seeing the first impressions from the members here.
Well, I think that it's quite interesting. I was listening to how you were explaining different ideas, and it's very pleasing to see that all of them reflect on very similar pillars. You want to better understand what is around you. In this case, the food you eat, the way you relate to others, the way others relate to you. There are topics that don't forget where you come from, which is, I think, quite interesting. And sometimes we forget about those, especially in the world in which seems that innovation is about always creating something new and forgetting where we are building on top of. So this idea, I think, really reflects on what we do in general, and I like that you give it different flavors and different shapes that somehow bring us back to what Guillaume highlighted earlier. You are already practicing or putting into practice a lot of these things without knowing, because it comes naturally. And that maybe gives us a good insight as well on how we as humans in society like to relate to one another. Maybe we think that the projects that we want to do are meant for us and for the society, and not for us, but for a big company to make money and simply to accumulate somehow. Which I think the trends that we have been discussing today and the different problematics that or challenges we might think of are probably consequences of those. And we try to revert that by being more connected, by understanding our knowledge, by documenting it, by collecting it, by sharing it with others. And that might be in very different flavors, from data collection, from reading books, from just going outside and talking to people, to sharing the way we design things or how we meet, etc., etc. And at the end, bringing, I think in our case, what I like to think is that these tools facilitate, but they don't define. So they allow you to connect with others, they allow you to collect all this information, but they don't define what you do. So the same tool and the same principle can be applied to many things. And it's very nice to see that even if you're talking about environmental sensing or how many times you've worn certain items or your wardrobe, somehow you feel the need to understand it because there are some questions that are unanswered, which then brings you to different steps of this process, right? So wherever, irrespective of the challenge, I think this probably needs a lot of time to probably think and materialize it in a way that you want to put it. And there are many iterations, but I like that these practices are already there as a principle and a way to act.
Thank you, Oscar. Always great to hear your opinion as well. So the schedule shifted a bit today. I think that has benefits as well as downsides. I hope you can bear with me, and I hope you enjoyed that anyways, because we had a bit more time in the beginning because there were some questions for Oscar and Guillaume. What I would suggest to do is I'm going to briefly introduce you to the exercise that we wanted to do today, which is for putting in practice on a specific project that maybe you have or you know from last week, in how we can, what would be the steps or what would be some thought processes on how to make that open source. I will share today with you, and then we will actually do this exercise next week to make sure that we're not forgetting this one, but just to be respectful with the time. And furthermore, we will hopefully be able to finalize within this week, also latest next session, the co-creation of the theme for the contest. I think it's really valuable to let that sit a bit during the week and digest a bit that information and the thoughts, and then next week we can revisit it. I'm going to share again my screen. I'm just gonna show you the exercise that we wanted to do. So thank you also Daphne for joining. I know it was a shift of plan, but let's be a bit flexible. So as you see, here's the Miro board that we always use for all of our sessions. You will see here, besides the exercise and the presentation that will add later on, also all the tools and methods and inspiration that was shared during the session today. So you will find everything down here to visit them and to see if that might be inspirational for you. And the exercise that we actually wanted to do is over here. Here it is in English, but on the other side there will be a Vietnamese translation as usual. So basically you were introduced to the project Smart Citizen today by Guillaume and Oscar. And we wanted to do a small exercise of like evaluating it with your personal point of view. I'm saying this in quotation marks. So from your point of view, you would share with, as a group, what you think that Smart Citizen is applying within their project. So here are some topics where you can put a little check mark to make sure that is applied or not applied. So some of these things would be, for example, do they allow free redistribution of the product, or do they publish the bill of the materials? So all of these different kinds of topics. And then if you think that Smart Citizen does that, sorry for the speech, you can just add through copy and paste the little check and say, yes, this is something you would do. And this is just to engage you in the thought process of what it means that a product or a service or a project is open source. And in the end, you could give it like a total rating from 0 to 10. And this you can do with any project that you have. You can do this exercise with your personal project, maybe a product that you see online that's open to do with anything else. And then there are some other like value dimensions that help you to identify more specific areas of values that the project that you have, or for in this case, Smart Citizen has. Anyways, we will go into this in more detail next week because it's a very broad, quick introduction. And then the other thing is what we wanted to do is that you take your personal project or the one you used last week to go through the discussion how it can be made open source. So you see this little canvas here that goes through the different beneficiaries of like making something open source. There's a you as well as the stakeholders, and then the exchange streams. And I again will explain this in more detail next week together with Daphne. But basically you would go step by step through this canvas, starting by number 1, and you would write down one or more elements of your product that could be open source. So when, for example, Cynthia was talking before about her work with the artisanal people in textiles, maybe you can imagine 1 or 2 things, like a how-to for using, for using a specific tool, for example. Maybe that could be open source to use a machine or tool. This is just a suggestion here. And so you would go through each of these steps and would try to answer these questions. And this helps you to identify possible areas of what you could do open source and what it means for you and for other beneficiaries. Again, we will do this a bit more with time and patience next week to explain. But until next week, you can, if you want, take a look at this canvas with the translated version. You will see this over here. Everything will be in hopefully a bit self-explanatory. And if not, please write me an email and I'm happy to answer any questions. And also we shared up here the key learnings from Oscar's and Guillem's presentation. And then down here are some canvases that we will go and look into next week. Here on the side are the areas of interest from the people who have shared today. So you will be able to see everything from today in the 28th of June session. So sorry for the shift of plan. Let's talk about this next week though. Mai, you wanted to say something.
Yes. Chị Jessica vừa lướt qua những cái bài tập mà lẽ ra là hôm nay mình sẽ làm, nhưng mà vì cái phần brainstorming chủ đề cho nên là mình không có kịp điểm qua, không có kịp làm cùng với nhau á. Thì từ giờ đến thứ Ba tuần sau mọi người có thể tham khảo cái nội dung bài tập này và cái gọi là cái thước đo độ mở của cái dự án để hiểu thêm về những cái như là những cái mức độ mở trong dự án, xem thử là mình đạt được những cái tiêu chí nào thì đánh dấu tích vào cái chỗ đó. Và tuần sau thì mình cũng sẽ làm thêm cái bài tập về cái gọi là openness discussion, tức là thảo luận về cái độ mở của dự án. Thì mọi người có thể tham khảo cái nội dung bài tập trước, cái đó thì tuần sau mình sẽ cùng làm. Và có những cái nội dung mà mình vừa brainstorm lúc nãy về chủ đề cuộc thi á, thì cũng có ở trên cái trang Mirror cho mọi người suy nghĩ thêm, và nếu mà có cái ý tưởng gì mới thì mọi người cũng có thể thêm vào. Thank you, Jessica. I just summarized what you explained about the exercises.
Thank you so much, Mai. I also just read actually Doi's explanation of his game. So thank you very much for writing it out in the chat. I highly appreciate it. I haven't been able to read all of it yet, but as Mai suggested, maybe you can add this information in the Miro link as well. That would be really valuable. Like it. Yes. And okay, I was writing a message, so I will just not send it now because I already said it. Anyways, I hope this session was nice for you all. It's already 2 minutes past 10 for you, so I know it's quite late. Thank you all for joining today. I highly appreciated all the inputs and all the ideas. And we will meet each other next week again for free to share any thoughts, concerns, and questions via email as usual to me directly, and I'm happy to answer them during the week.
Thanks, Jessica. Nếu mà từ giờ đến tuần sau mọi người có thắc mắc hay là câu hỏi gì thì có thể email chị Jessica. Chị vừa viết cái địa chỉ mail vào trong cái chat box, và cái nội dung mà tới chia sẻ thì tới có thể là viết nó thành một cái note xong rồi cho vào trang Mirror luôn để mọi người có thể tiếp tục nghiền ngẫm. Tại vì hôm nay cũng có nhiều bạn vì lý do công việc không có tham gia được cái phần cùng kiến tạo cái chủ đề này á, cho nên là ban tổ chức đề xuất là tuần sau mình sẽ tích hợp thêm những cái ý tưởng của các bạn hôm nay không có đến được nữa trước khi đưa ra cái chủ đề. Cảm ơn mọi người đã dành thời gian tham dự. Hôm nay thì kéo dài hơn bình thường một chút, mà mọi người cũng cảm ơn mọi người đã đưa ra những cái ý tưởng rất là sôi nổi. Thank you everyone for joining. It's been great hearing your thoughts. And we'll see you next week.
Exactly. See you next week. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jessica.